Hello, I'm Daniel Benjamin, and I'm president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this spring semester's Stephen Kellen Lecture, which will be delivered by Sir Ronald Cohen. Let me begin by apologizing for coming to you by Zoom. 2 years into the pandemic, I've finally been caught. I had close contact with someone who has come down with COVID. More information than you could possibly want, but while I'm testing negative, I'm a prisoner in my own apartment, and I guess that this was an experience that was promised to me in some way or another. In any case, we take our public health rules very seriously at the American Academy, and now you know more about my health than you wanted. I am very sorry not to be with you tonight, and especially sorry that I can't be with this evening's speaker, Sir Ronald Cohen. Before I get to introducing Sir Ronald, I want to first thank our trustee, Gail Burt, who couldn't be here tonight, but who did introduce Sir Ronald to the Academy. Gail has been with the Academy since its earliest days and was a longtime chair of the Board of Trustees. She's been a huge help to me in many ways, but not least in bringing some really remarkable guests to the Academy. So thank you, Gail, and I look forward to repeating that in person soon. It is particularly fitting that Sir Ronald, a giant in the world of finance, is delivering the Stephen Kellen Lecture because Stephen Kellen in his time was also an enormously important financier, particularly when it came to helping German firms rebuild and the German economy to revive after World War II, an effort we know with hindsight was incredibly important to the success of the West in the post-war period. Like Sir Ronald, Stephen Kellen and his wife, Anna Maria, who grew up in our villa on the Wannsee, were strong believers that wealth was not an end in itself, but an instrument for doing good. Numerous institutions have benefited from their extraordinary generosity, including, of course, the American Academy. The Kellen-Arnold family continues to be deeply engaged at the Academy, and I'm hugely grateful, along with so many others, for their support. There is one other similarity between our speaker and the man for whom this lecture is named. Both had the searing experience of being refugees. Stephen Kellen had to flee the Nazis in the 1930s. A much younger Ronald Cohen had to escape from Nasser's Egypt after the Suez campaign. I apologize for digressing, but at a time when more than 3 million have fled their homes in Ukraine in just the last month, I think it's worth contemplating the incredible achievements of refugees past, like Stephen Kellen and Sir Ronald Cohen, and remembering how vital it is to support today's refugees so that they can develop despite all of the upheaval that they are facing. Now to return to our speaker. After his family's flight from Egypt, Ronald Cohen grew up in London, overcame his lack of English so effectively that he won a scholarship to Oxford a few years later, and after receiving his undergraduate degree, was awarded a fellowship to attend Harvard Business School. While still in his 20s, he co-founded Apex Partners, one of Britain's very first venture capital firms and an enormously successful one. Apex provided startup capital for more than 500 companies, some of which are household names today. In 2000, at the request of the British Treasury, Sir Ronald turned his ingenuity to public service when he became the chair of the Social Investment Task Force, which was set the task of figuring out how entrepreneurial skills could be used to deal with pressing social challenges. What followed was a succession of ever deeper forays into efforts to make capitalism work for more and more of the population. To see how the tools of investment and fast improving skills in data analysis could help deal with environmental degradation, poverty, recidivism, inadequate health care, substandard education, and the like. The work that he and others were pioneering became known as social investment and eventually impact investment. Sir Ronald, who was knighted in 2001 and whose own impact investing and philanthropic accomplishments are myriad, became both the British government's and the G7's go-to man for charting new ways to make capitalism remedy critical social ills, including many that it itself had caused. And today investors have placed something like $1 trillion in impact funds that promote the goals of ESG, environmental sustainable governance. As in his views, he will soon tell you this is only the start and that there is a way forward that will help the international community meet the gold standard of social change, the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, through impact investing. Sir Ronald, though he may not look it, is a self-proclaimed revolutionary. In his new book, Impact, Reshaping Capitalism to Drive Real Change, which just coincidentally came out in German, he writes, quote, "Our economic system is self-defeating. Unfettered capitalism creates huge social and environmental problems, which governments try to fix by taxing everyone, while investors and companies focus only on making money. It makes no sense." The good news is he has an answer, and that is what we want to hear about tonight. Sir Ronald, the podium is yours.
The story of the person who opens a newspaper and reads his own obituary. So he calls the newspaper and said, "Hey, I've just read my obituary in your paper." And the chap at the other end said, "Excuse me, sir, where are you calling from?" Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you very much to Daniel, to you, Berit, and to all the team at the American Academy for hosting us this evening. And I really see this as an exchange of views. Already over dinner we have begun the conversation, rather than a speech by me. So I will speak for 20 to 30 minutes. I've been given 30 minutes. I may extend to the 30 minutes. And then we will engage in conversations together. So we all know the world cannot continue to function in the way that it's doing. We look at our climate issues today, they can't be coped with even by governments. And when we look at social inequality, we realize that the social inequality doesn't come through through government policy. It comes through businesses. Businesses, through their employment practices, are creating social inequality. And so we realize that capitalism, which has served us so well for 250 years in lifting people out of poverty into prosperity, creates consequences now that are so great that we can't continue in the same way. And so the question is, how do we cope with these huge environmental and social challenges? And I feel, as you will hear, that we are already in a revolution, an impact revolution, which follows the tech revolution, which I was privileged to play a role in, and which reminds me a lot. I have a sense of déjà vu about this impact revolution because I saw it in the tech revolution. So I'd like, if you allow, to start by just saying a few words about how I got involved in the tech revolution and why I see these similarities. So, like Daniel, I went to Oxford and Harvard, and when I was at Harvard Business School in my early 20s, I sensed that something new and very powerful was in the air. I mustn't get out of the light. I have this tendency to walk around, but something new and very powerful was in the air. A professor came, an unlikely figure, General Doriot, a French general who became one of the first venture capitalists, and explained that he had invested $70,000 in a new computer company making something new, mini computers. It was called Digital Equipment, and the company was going to go public, and his stake would be worth $100 million. Now, you can imagine, as a refugee, the son of refugees, hearing sums like that caught my attention. And so I thought, wow. And then I realized that this mini computer came from the invention of the microchip, and that young entrepreneurs were looking at these new technologies and aiming to overtake the big established leaders in the field by disrupting, in the term that we use today, their business models. And it seemed natural to me to suppose that young people with new technologies would apply them faster and more skillfully than long-established organizations with a past of great success, which had convinced them that their way was right. And indeed, it's what happened, because, of course, Apple and Microsoft overtook IBM, and we've seen it repeated in many different industries. Now, what led to this tech revolution really taking off was a change that none of you have probably focused on. And the change came from people at the University of Chicago who looked at investment and said, risk has always been there, but we've never measured it. What if we begin to measure risk? If we begin to look at how bonds and stocks and shares move around over time and get a sense for what they call the volatility of these different forms of investment and make predictions about the future risk. And that brought some new thinking in the form of risk-adjusted returns, which led to the concept of diversification. Because if some investments are riskier but deliver more return, it may still make sense to include them in a portfolio. But of course, if you do so, you can't put your whole portfolio in it. You have to diversify your risk. And so the concept of risk measurement really gave me my opportunity in life, because it brought the concept of diversification, which opened the door to investment in venture capital and in private equity, opened the door to the tech revolution, and opened the door to globalization. Because investing in emerging markets was also viewed as a very risky way to invest. And so when I went back to the UK, my fellowship, the Henry Fellowship, required me to bring something of value to the UK from my studies in the United States. I brought back venture capital. In those days, entrepreneurs existed only, at least in the public imagination, in the United States. It was thought that a European entrepreneur was a contradiction in terms. Fear of failure, etc. But it was obvious, again, to me, that if you have a young generation of people now coming with these new ideas, they would be spread across the whole world. They weren't only going to be in one province or another. And so I decided to establish a venture capital fund. And it took me, we started in 1972 when I was 26 years old and a bit, what became Apex Partners. It took us 9 years to get to the first venture capital fund. And then from 1981 to 2005, when I left, we went from a £10 million fund to £5 billion fund. And today we are at £10 billion and more. And today Apex manages $75 billion. So very significant amounts of money ended up going into these asset classes. So the management of risk came because of its measurement. And we live at a time now where something similar is happening. Because you will probably have read the announcement yesterday by the SEC that every company, at least it's a proposal for discussion over the next 60 days, that it should become mandatory for every company to disclose its environmental impacts. Environmental impacts that are made through operations, through products, through supply chain, and so on. And I think that's the first step, and the next step, which isn't going to take very long to come in my view, will be the measurement of social impacts. Because alongside climate, the huge issue confronting us is social inequality, which at its base very often comes from lack of diversity. And so I'll talk about it in a moment. We are going to be measuring and accounting for the impacts of companies through their operations on the environment, through their employment practices on people, through their products on people and the environment, and through their supply chains on people and the environment. This force of transparency was something which, even 3 years ago, you would have heard virtually nobody saying could possibly be successful. And yet, at the time of COP26, there was an announcement that the organization responsible for all financial accounting outside of the United States, IFRS Foundation, not an easy name to remember, but nevertheless, would be establishing a sustainable standards board to standardize the measurement of these impacts I've described, starting with their metrics, quantities of carbon, quantities of water, impacts on diversity, but measuring also employment metrics of a parallel kind. So the question, are we going to be measuring impacts, has already been answered. The question that remains is, how do we bring impacts into financial analysis and the valuation of companies? And I want to just explain a little bit about how I see this evolving. About 3 years ago, here in Germany, the Value Balancing Alliance, which Saori chairs and Christian is the CEO of, started to work on this issue of valuation of impacts. And in Boston, an effort that I chair at Harvard Business School, the Impact Weighted Accounts Initiative, led by brilliant Greek-American professor George Seraphim, set out to do the same. And actually, these two organizations are working extremely closely together now. And I want to give you just a few insights in what comes out of the research and the data that we have published. So, if I ask you today to describe the pollution created by different companies, you would do it in general terms. Some companies do more than others and so on and so forth. But we measured 3,000 companies' environmental effects over a period of 10 years. And if I say to you that out of these 3,000 companies, 450 create more environmental damage in a year in monetary terms than profit, that begins to give you a sense of the insights that you get from this research. 1,000 of these companies deliver 25% or more of their profit in damage each year. Taken together, the 3,000 companies, wait for it, deliver $4 trillion worth of damage in a single year. And most importantly, when you analyze the value of these companies and relate it to their pollution, you see that the companies that deliver more pollution are worth less. So there are leaders and laggards within every sector. Some sectors are very high pollution, as we all know, electric utilities, construction industry, the chemical industry, other industries are high pollution intrinsically. But when you look within each group, you see leaders and laggards. Some companies are achieving superior impact performance relative to their competitors. Now, you might then say, well, fine, but how do you measure diversity? Well, we've just published 2,600 companies' employment impacts, measuring diversity, differences in pay between genders, ethnic groups, and so on, and differences in advancement, progression through the companies. We've measured the demographics, which you can do now because of big data and computing power, outside a company's facilities and inside. We've ascribed a remuneration level to the missing people from these different groups and viewed the remuneration lost as the economic cost to that community of not having been employed. And it brings you to comparisons like this one. If you compare Amazon and Apple in terms of diversity today, does anybody have a sense of who the better performer is? I doubt it. Apple? You think Apple is? Okay. So here are the figures. Amazon has $6.7 billion a year of diversity debit, measured in the way I've described. Apple has $2.4 billion diversity debit. However, if you relate the diversity debit to the wage bill, Apple has 24% of its wage bill in diversity debit, and Amazon 16%. So actually, Amazon is the better performer of the two, even though the diversity debit in absolute terms is greater. And we can begin to analyze now the correlation between diversity debit remuneration levels and labor turnover. And we can see correlations between companies that retain their employees longer and better financial performance. So once again, you can begin to see how putting a valuation on impacts and bringing them initially as an addition to financial statements will begin to allow investors to analyze the value of a company in different ways. Because if you are one of the 450 companies today that are delivering more damage than profit each year, and some of your competitors are doing a better job, and everybody has the figures, what's going to happen to your share price? Your share price is going to fall. Why? Not just because people will say, well, nobody talented would want to work for a company like, we've seen the ExxonMobil example. For a company like ExxonMobil, which within its industry, and I can give you the numbers in a moment, is a big polluter relative to Shell and BP. Exxon delivers from its operations $39 billion of damage a year. Shell 23, BP 13, right? So if you're a talented person in the fossil fuel industry, are you going to be very comfortable working for ExxonMobil? Well, if you're a young person, probably not today. Also, will your customers be concerned about buying from you? Do they have pressures to show that their supply chain doesn't create a lot of pollution? So by beginning to bring transparency, we create a race to the top among companies, and it's reflected and driven by their valuations. So you can imagine a world where a board meeting, I think in the second half of this decade, I think we will get to mandatory impact transparency on both environmental and social within the next 3 to 5 years. My aim is that it should come by 25, so just 3 years from now. And there are reasons why it's going to happen. The main reason is that the information I've been describing is flowing today to some investors and not others. What does that mean for regulators? Regulators have to make sure that every investor is treated in the same way. which means getting the same information on a comparable basis, on a verified basis, at the same time. So the more this data flows, the more regulators have to go to mandatory publication of standardized numbers. So a mechanism, it's not a coincidence that the SEC is going there and that the IFRS has already gone there. It's being driven by regulators. Regulators are saying to these standard-setting bodies, we need to provide transparency to all investors at the same time. Now, this force of transparency has huge implications for the change of our whole economic system, because it meets two other forces that are extremely powerful, and that's where I say I have the same sense of déjà vu with the tech revolution today. The first force is one you're all familiar with. It's the force of a change in values, which started 10, 15 years ago with younger generations that didn't want to work for companies that were polluting, didn't want to buy their products. Nike, with child labor, had a major scandal which affected its sales. And investors became aware that there were very serious implications for the profitability of their investments. And so you began to see the ESG trend, which today is a mega trend, accelerate. Now, what is ESG? ESG is environmental, social, and governance investment. So it's investment where the investor seeks to achieve profit, but also usually a reduction in negative impact, and it doesn't measure it today. But the transparency I've been talking about would connect with this $40 trillion. Alongside ESG, you now have more than $2 trillion of investment that is going to bring solutions, impact solutions, to improve the world by bringing new solutions to existing problems. And last year alone, from a standing start, we have seen $1 trillion, Lavinia and I were talking about it over dinner, in sustainability-linked loans and bonds, where the borrower, the company that borrows it, if it achieves certain preset targets, environmental or social, so we see electricity utilities and we see pharmaceutical companies setting targets, and if they meet them, the cost of their loan, the interest they pay, goes down by 25 or 50 basis points. So we see already measurement coming to mainstream financial products. So this change in values has reflected itself in massive changes in our capital flows. And capital flows are the lifeblood of a capitalist economy. It's capital flows that change the behavior of companies. So it is a very significant change in values that we are witnessing today. The third major force is the force of technology. Now, most of us are aware that there is a lot of investment going into technology now. The amount invested in venture capital hit an all-time high last year, with over $300 billion going into venture capital deals. That is more than twice the amount at the beginning of the decade. So not the beginning of the decade, then 2000, the beginning of the past decade, and that was the peak then, 2.5 times that amount. This money is going to disrupt companies that are creating negative impact, and you see it with Tesla already. So what does Tesla do? In the terms that I describe in my book, Tesla optimizes risk, return, and impact. It reduces the pollution that the combustion engine brings. It helped it to attract customers. Its technology has delivered a superior product. It's threatened the existing automobile manufacturers. It's worth more than 5 of them together today, $1 trillion. I won't deny that the valuation is very high, but it's a very significant fact, nevertheless. And it shifted the whole of the automobile industry to electric vehicles. We're going to see this in every industry, which is today emitting, significant quantities of carbon or other gases into the atmosphere or water into our waterways or eroding the soil. I see entrepreneurs. I'm investing now through my family office in tech companies, mainly in Israel. My wife is Israeli. I've moved from Egypt to Israel, 400 kilometers via the UK, in young tech companies, but I also see what's going on in Europe and in the United States. I see entrepreneurs everywhere now imagining new markets that they want to lead. They can be markets in carbon capture. They can be markets in clean energy. They can be markets in alternative proteins. Sauri and I were talking about it today. The projections for alternatives to meat and other animal food are predicted to grow at 35% a year. And so entrepreneurs are focusing on this, are raising very significant capital in sums which, when I started, you couldn't dream of. My first fund was £10 million. Today, a company will raise $100 million like that. I backed a venture in Israel led by the first woman in Israel to achieve unicorn status. She actually got to $3.7 billion valuation in the space of 5 years. A unicorn is a company that is worth $1 billion, as many of you will know, a venture that becomes worth $1 billion. And they all integrate impact. Einat Gez, to whom I've referred, a company called Papaya Global, has $300 million in the bank for a company that is 5 years old. So the sums of money, I want to give you the sense that the sums of money that are flowing now to develop new markets based on new technologies that bring technology and impact together are creating massive potential disruption. And any company that doesn't take it into account today would make the same mistake people made in the tech revolution. When I remember some people saying, oh, the tech revolution, it's going to affect the computer industry. They didn't anticipate that this revolution, the microchip, the miniaturization of computing power, the PC, the cellular phone, the internet, and so on, would transform every industry. It was unthinkable when the PC came out that retailing could shift away from the high street to the internet. Unthinkable. And the same is going to be happening again now. Now, revolutions happen out of necessity. We have 3 forces now: the change in values, the leaps in technology, and they're not just in the fields I've talked about. In the field of health, you're seeing telehealth, you're seeing computing and the genome coming together. I mean, it's widespread. And we're seeing this transparency all coming together. And what are they actually achieving? What they are achieving is a shift in our whole economies, away from just optimizing risk and return to optimizing risk, return, and impact. And if you think about the implications of this terrible war between Russia and the Ukraine today, I believe it's going to accelerate the advance of impact investment. Because if we're going to get to resource-efficient, sustainable economies that invest in their social capital in order to reduce inequality, then governments aren't going to have the budgets to do this. They can no longer do it alone. They're going to have to rely on the changes in the capital markets, which are driving these considerable flows today to achieving impact as well as profit. So we're shifting to a new type of capitalism, where impact, as the invisible heart of markets, guides their invisible hand. Thank you very much. Are you still awake?
It's time to wake up now. Now you will be asked. Thank you for a fascinating talk. So we will have about half an hour for a conversation with Sir Ronald, and I invite you to ask...
Please call me Ronnie, everyone.
With Ronnie, and I invite you to ask questions. Don't be shy. I know you are not. The same applies to the Zoom audience, and in order to kick off the conversation, I have prepared a few questions for you. When you refer to impact investment, and especially at the end, you said it's of course pretty clear that everyone should believe in it. And we're talking about reorienting capital markets to a more beneficial and to more better environmental ends. How, and in an ideal world, yes, we all should believe in it, but how ready are public markets to it? And given that there is this switch and no longer only being or no longer only focusing on higher yields, what kind of investors are attracted by it? You were talking a lot about the younger generation, but perhaps is there hope for other people as well, who are not only the younger ones?
No, what started out as pressure from the younger generation and became visible to investors of all ages amounted to about $13 trillion in 2013 when I led the G8 task force. Today the figure is over 40, 7 years later, 8 years later, the figure is over 40 trillion, growing at 20% a year or more. We see investment managers coming under pressure from adult investors as well as the children of adult investors who put pressure on them. We see pressure coming from every direction. It's not surprising that the BlackRock is now, $9 trillion or whatever, and has got a significant portion invested in ESG. Some investors are particularly interested in environmental. As we begin to get the data, we will see their ranks increase with those who are interested in social as well. So we can no longer think that this could be a passing thing. This is a mega trend today. It affects every investor. There are some investors, just as happened with the tobacco companies, who don't care about all this baloney about combining ethics and profit and impact and all these highfalutin ideas, who will continue to invest in coal mines and and other things, and may be able to derive a profit from it, despite the negative impact, just as investors in tobacco companies have done. But the more successful companies, the Apples, the Microsofts of the coming generation, are going to look like Tesla. And a unicorn in this coming decade will be a venture that becomes worth $1 billion but improves the lives of 1 billion people. That's how it is being redefined.
Right. And thank you, and kind of on the other side of the equation, talking about inside of the companies. How do duties and responsibilities in the companies change due to impact investment? What does it do to the workforce? What does it do to the directors? We have a few here in the audience, and they can learn now. So you can be elaborate on that answer.
Right. So some companies, very good, very important question. Some companies are thought leaders and see this as something that's desirable because they think it's morally right and because they think it also is going to be good for their bottom line, and that they are trying to get ahead of the curve. So they want to be performing better than their competitors, and they're taking action to achieve that. It's a minority. The mass of companies is very concerned about impact transparency. They don't know what it's going to reveal. The result isn't going to be as awful as some of them anticipate, because what we see from the Harvard data is that the employment impact of companies is massive. So if you take the wage bills of a company, even after deducting the diversity debit and all the underpayments because of, below the living wage payments or whatever, there is still a massive social impact that comes from employment. But investors are going to look within the same sector, as I was doing with Amazon and Apple, and say, who is the better performer? And they're going to put pressure on companies. And they're going to put pressure in two ways. They're going to put pressure as investors at shareholder meetings. So we were hearing today, Sauri was saying, I think it's okay to quote you, Sauri, on this, that in the United States there are now over 1,000 lawsuits against companies on the subject of climate. In Europe, there are over 50 currently. We've all probably been aware of the judgment against Shell in the Netherlands that it has to reduce its carbon emissions by 40% before the end of the decade. These are new. So that's one way of that's a second way of putting pressure. So we're seeing it at the Procter & Gamble shareholder meeting, where shareholders are putting management on the spot by asking for figures about deforestation that comes from the use of palm oil and what they intend to do about it. We're seeing it at the ExxonMobil shareholder meeting, where three directors were kicked off and 3 new directors the board didn't want, were appointed. And we're seeing it through the law courts. And it's going to lead to a change in legislation about the duties of directors. The Milton Friedman doctrine, which lasted 50 years, that the duty of a company is to make profit. And I know some people say he was taken out of context, but the fact of the matter is it was the prevailing doctrine in the last 5 decades. That doctrine is going to have to give way to the optimization of risk, return, and impact. So we're going to see precedents set through the law courts, changes in regulation and legislation about directors' duties and everything that flows from redefining those duties.
Are especially looking at the environmental impact you were talking about. Can you say a little bit more about blockchain technologies and whether you think they are evaluated differently from an impact investment perspective? Are they doing better?
Yeah. So, I mean, blockchain technology will be here to stay. The environmental impact of having these huge server farms, which have to be air-conditioned, and the massive computing power, that often goes with blockchain, or certainly with digital currencies, that may be capable of finding a solution, through air conditioning and so on and so forth. But the issue of digital currencies is a more difficult one. There's no doubt that digital currencies have taken hold in the younger generation. My kids invest in Bitcoin. I haven't invested in Bitcoin thus far. I find it difficult to get my head around artificially constrained supply of something, and demand which is often from questionable places, trying to avoid regulation and taxation and so on and so forth, as becoming a bona fide marketplace. But there's no doubt that the price has gone through the roof. So I'm not the person to give you a judgment on digital currencies.
Okay, but then you can give me a judgment on something else. You said you didn't invest in Bitcoin. What kind of advice would you give a young investor today?
I would give, well, I think a young investor today who doesn't have the ability to analyze companies one by one is much better off investing in indices. And what we're finding now is the indices are beginning to take ESG into account. So BlackRock is one of the leading firms in this. And you couldn't do it even 5 years ago. I talked with an investment bank and they wanted to sell me a consumer product portfolio. And I said, I want to take tobacco and this and that out of it. Tobacco, gambling, alcohol, and so on. And they came back and they said, we can't do it. Now you can find indices of this kind. I would, if I were an investor today, a young investor, they're very familiar with technology. They spend a ton of time on the internet. I would spot products that you think are going to be successful and look for indices that focus on that. So there are clean energy indices. If you look at what the clean energy indices have done, they've gone like that, when fossil fuel indices have gone like that, That's what I would do.
Thank you. And I see we have one question here. And yeah, we start in the back and then, okay.
Are we good? Thank you. Thanks so much for a great talk. So my question is about really how the system works. That is to say, I can understand that companies will be competing with one another to look better in this world of new transparency. But what's to prevent them from bunching at the bottom? What new roles do you see for governments, for example, or other kinds of institutions to play in setting benchmarks or standards or frameworks or institutional roadmaps that will lead to actually a rise to the top rather than a bunching toward the bottom? If the purpose is just to be better than people who are bad, then what will prevent people from, companies from just being bad?
You're totally right. And the role of government now has become crucial. That's why you see the G7 Impact Task Force report that just appeared in December, entitled Time to Deliver. And it's focusing on the advance through impact valuation to impact accounting and saying to government, look, you have to provide this transparency as a first step. But once you provide the transparency, government has the tools then to incentivize the right behavior. So if you start taxing carbon emissions, we hear of a carbon tax already, right? If you start taxing carbon emissions, then you prevent the bunching of the bottom because they're going to pay a ton of tax. It's going to reduce their profits and the value of the company. At the same time, government can provide incentives. It can provide lower rates of taxation for companies that achieve certain social or environmental benefits. So the transparency begins to give government ways to impose fairer taxation that encourage investment in improving the environment and society. Where we are today with government is that governments sit between a corporate world that, on the whole, would like to prevent this transparency and what flows from it, and talent and customers and investors who are all pushing government to act. I think revolutions come out of necessity. And I think government is going to have to act because government won't have the resources to cope without bringing private capital into the equation. But bringing private capital doesn't mean that government abdicates its role. We haven't talked about it, but the impact revolution, in my view, but I'm a biased revolutionary, started when the first social impact bond was launched in 2010. I'm biased because I was involved in inventing and in implementing it. And the social impact bond was a £5 million bond focused on young prisoners at Peterborough Prison, 60% of whom were going back to prison within 18 months. And we raised £5 million to invest in charitable companies and NGOs working with these prisoners. And we signed a deal with the government saying, will you pay us? And they agreed to so much. They put the numbers down. We will pay you so much for every percentage point reduction that you achieve in the number of prisoners going back. In the event, number of prisoners fell by 9.7%. And the investors got their £5 million back with a 3.1% annual return. It was the first time there was a security where the financial return depended on the social improvement. You would have thought that governments would have seized this with both hands. After all, they only pay when the result has been achieved. The investor takes the risk of loss, has to make the judgment about whether the NGO or the business can achieve these results. There's a huge benefit to the government, a huge saving. If prisoners don't go back to prison, they don't go through the law courts, who don't have to pay for prisons. And so you'd have thought governments would have acted there. They haven't. It's the same mechanism in a slightly different form as the $1 trillion in private markets today. So what's happening is governments don't really get these new ideas. They have procurement systems where they're used to funding inputs. They don't measure outcomes. They don't know when the government program has really been value for money or not. Sometimes you have inquiries about it. But you don't, as a matter of course, as you would with a social impact bond, no, 9.7% reduction, it was worth doing. So the time has come now, I think, with these massive sums floating around, with the pressure on budgets, with a lot of expenditure going to defense away from social causes, in all likelihood as a result of this war. I hope we can get governments to connect with it. And each of you, all of you, are in thought-leading, influential positions in your organization. Each of you has a role in achieving this. Now, even the release of unclaimed assets, which we talked about at dinner, we hope that Germany, perhaps you'll tell us about it, that Germany will take this money, which belongs to people who have lost contact with it, and the money's remained within the banks. You'd think every country would say, if the UK has £2 billion of these, and Japan has $5 or $6 billion of it, every government should immediately go to retrieve this money and apply it for social purpose. But there are only a handful of countries that have picked the ideas up. So I think all of you have a role in urging government now to connect with these new ways of thinking. But there is a deeper level to the question that you've asked. The deeper level is that actually you make more money by optimizing risk, return, and impact than by just optimizing risk and return today. So imagine you're a company that is polluting Take a coal company. A coal company that persists in remaining a coal company today is seeing its profits go all the way down. Take a Tesla, optimizing risk-return impact, you create massive value. And that's the reason that this shift is going to happen in our economic system. It actually is a better way to grow and to be profitable. And I say that as an investor, which is why I've been investing in these impact ventures.
All right, we have Professor Rochow in the front, and then we have Professor Borda in the middle.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very enlightening, actually inspiring talk. I would like to pick up one example that you mentioned, which is this comparison of BP, Shell, and ExxonMobil. And I'm just wondering about the following. Whether we should advise young people actually to start working for the better companies or for the worse companies. For the following reason, if we advise them to work, I mean, it might be obvious to say for the good companies, but why, actually I would argue, why not to advise them to work for the worst companies? Because the impact they can have is much bigger working for the bad companies, right? So this means they can really change things. They can really have an impact. So in that sense, what I'm wondering is whether we should think in impact terms, not so much about the static measure, but rather about the dynamic one, or you could say, mathematically speaking, about the derivative. So what actually changes between, what could be changed actually between today and tomorrow by having a real impact. And I'm wondering about the same thing when we, say, go from employment or labor markets to financial markets, where it may also be the case that actually, wouldn't it be much better for the investors to invest in ExxonMobil, simply because they can change more than they can by just investing in another green company. So that means really trying to give incentives for the best, for the brightest, for the, say, most insightful capital and employees to actually go for the massive, or say the maximum change they can have, and really thinking about this as the, basically, so to say, the socially optimal outcome.
Yeah. So, very good question. So the answer lies in the quality of management. If the management of ExxonMobil, as it was saying, is we believe in fossil fuels, we don't believe in all this baloney of clean energy, and we're going to continue to invest in fossil fuels, then as a young person, going to work for that company would not be a good choice, clearly. Whereas at BP, they're saying BP stands for not British Petroleum, but beyond petroleum. We're investing in clean energy, and we want to be the leaders in the field of hydrogen and other new forms of fuel. That would be a lot more exciting. So it depends on management. But this question of should you engage doesn't have to do with how much pollution you're creating. It has to do with what management wants to do in leading the company. So I'm not an advocate of disengaging from every company that is creating pollution. But if you have management that is stubbornly persisting in polluting, then we should disengage, because it's the way to bring change to that organization. Its share price will collapse, new management will come in, and then you have a shot at improving it.
Professor Burda, and then Armin von Falkenhayn.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Great talk. You rightfully stressed the role.
Mike is on your way. Sorry.
Great talk.
Thank you.
I like what you say, but you rightfully stress information and the role of information, and I'm a bit worried about greenwashing. Firms can fake a lot of stuff, and there's a lot of fake news out there anyway. What's to stop this from happening on a grand scale, and what kind of economic resources do you need to do an information counteroffensive, provide the right information, some sort of certification process?
Yeah, excellent question. Greenwashing is one of the big dangers today for this whole trend to impact. Because, as you correctly say, companies are making unsubstantiated claims or giving you partial information about positive impacts and leaving out all the negative impacts. The only real antidote to that is transparency. So, if ExxonMobil says, oh, look at the way we've cleaned these rivers in Timbuktu, you can say, yeah, but on the other hand, you have $39 billion of annual damage from your operations. And that's why we being the global steering group for impact investment, and many of my colleagues, 3 of my colleagues in the room, including Professor Alexander Bassen, who's sitting here, have been pushing so hard now to accelerate this transparency before greenwashing brings discredit on the whole field, saying it's highfalutin stuff, you'll never be able to solve greenwashing, this will never work.
Armin von Falkenhayn.
Yeah, really many thanks for your explanations. One question I have is actually in relation to exactly that question on how to attract investment. And you're absolutely right that as long as you have a free market, management can influence that. But in the very moment where you have a new taxonomy kicking in, which, for example, punishes whole industries like the cement industry, take cement, how do you avoid this misallocation of capital in a way that an industry which produces something which we cannot substitute so easily quickly, that it still gets the capital it needs to invest into new production processes?
Yeah. I mean, it's a very good question again. I think sending messages of this kind is actually helpful in the sense that it wakes entrepreneurs up to the opportunity to create new building materials that don't involve the pollution that cement causes. The problem with the taxonomy, as you correctly say, is that it isn't very easy to implement. It's very broad brush. And as an investor, if you stay out of all the high pollution areas, you're leaving out a big chunk of the economy. Whereas if you continue to invest in the best performers on an impact basis as well as a profit basis, you will do much better. So I hope that the EU's efforts, with the help of the Value Balancing Alliance, which advises the EU, will arrive at the conclusion that this taxonomy is just a first set of strokes on the canvas, and you need to move away to much more granular forms of comparison between companies. You have to go to transparency. In that context, it's quite interesting that the EU and the SEC, without having coordinated it, focus, the EU on investor transparency and the SEC on corporate transparency. And so we're sort of getting these two very powerful organizations now. Hopefully they'll meet in the middle. I think politicians will come to realize that if they don't want to legislate against companies, which leads to a lot of friction in the political system, then they have to let investors do the job, and they have to help, in coming back to your question about greenwashing, they have to help investors to do the job through changes in transparency and regulation around it.
Yes, there is. We go from the left to the right. Yep. Back to the front.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. One question coming back to your advice before on ESG investing or investing in an ESG index. How do you compare the impact there with another example you gave on prisoners, or you helped there? So is both, in your terms, impact investing, or how do you relate ESG investing against impact investing?
No, I think ESG is more minimization of negative impact, almost completely. And there's no reason why in your portfolio today, if you're a private investor or if you are a public investor like a pension fund, or if you're a charitable foundation, you should be investing in heavily polluting companies with your endowment, which is 95% of your capital, and with the 5% that you give away, funding environmental groups that are fighting pollution. And this is what's happening today. So I think everybody should be going to ESG. I don't think there's room now with the challenges that we face for investing in the laggards. I'm not saying desert every polluting industry, but certainly desert the laggards and go to those who might bring breakthroughs. Invest in venture capital, which is going to become increasingly democratized now. There are several efforts now to allow private investors to access good venture capital funds. And the advice to the young investor, I sort of started to say, sometimes young investors cotton on to a new company which is raising money through their, it certainly happened with my children. They hear about it through their friends, and they invest in a company that then can bring a new technology. But it's tough to do that if you have a full-time job and you don't have a network of friends who are active investors.
Delphine.
Thank you so much. This was a really fascinating talk, and I think the most optimistic account I've ever heard of the role that that capitalism can play in redressing some of the huge problems that it has caused. One question I have, and I think you might have partially answered it, in outlining the difference between ESG and social impact bonds, like the example you gave. So businesses have a huge impact on many areas of social life, but one trend that we've all noticed in recent years is how they have developed various strategies to take a step back from some of those responsibilities. And I'm thinking, for instance, of the precarization of workforces, the rise of, increasing numbers of people are no longer employees and no longer affiliated with businesses. And so there's, growing areas of social life which are not going to be connected to a business and tracked by these indicators. And so the question is how would this system encourage companies to continue in this direction? The Uberization of labor markets, for instance, and what might one response be?
So it's an excellent question, because I've talked about economic and financial system, but actually impact investment started, as you heard from Daniel, at least my thinking about impact investment, when in 2000 on the Social Investment Task Force, I addressed the issue which the government asked me to address. Why aren't we making more progress in dealing with poverty and its social consequences? And I realized that we had been relying on government expenditure, which is constantly under pressure, and philanthropy, which is a very small fraction, 1.5 trillion a year is given away. And we never managed to bring investment to non-profits. There's $200 to $300 trillion of investable money. And so the conclusion of our 2000 report was we need to connect social entrepreneurs who are often leading non-profits that aren't affected by the system I've described, to connect them to investment money, to investment capital. And it took us 10 years to invest a social impact bond. We created social finance in 2007, which was a recommendation of the 2000 report to create an investment bank that brought the expertise from the social side and the financial side to invent this way. And we invented pay for success. if you like, pay for successful outcomes. Now, what's happening today is, whereas a few years ago it was very difficult to get investors who said, I'm prepared to accept a 4% return if I'm going to be educating young people who otherwise would be illiterate and would have no future. Today, there's a massive money going into that, in the same way that the bond market is accepting a reduction in return if certain social or environmental objectives are achieved. So there's a category of investor today who says, I want to do good and do well at the same time. I'm prepared to forego some return if I have a valuable impact in addition to it. And one of the things I've been working on, again, it's described in my book, is called an outcomes fund for education in Africa and the Middle East. Now, in the case of the Peterborough bond, the government signed the contract, we will pay you so much. But if you want to improve the education of 10 million children in Africa and the Middle East, and you want to deploy $1 billion of outcomes fund to do it, which would be sufficient, in our view, in order to educate 10 million people, you need a professional organization to say, I'm prepared to pay so much for a child in Ghana that completes their primary school education, verified exam results, maybe using blockchain with the information inputted at source and so on and so forth to avoid corruption of the data. I'm prepared to pay so much if it's a young girl rather than a young boy, to pay more, even more if it's a child from a rural area, even more if it's a child who has a disability of some kind. So you have a tariff. And so we've signed up the first 2 programs of this $1 billion fund in the making, $30 million in Ghana to educate 300,000 children in the north of Ghana, and a similar sum for Sierra Leone. The creation of these outcomes fund, there are 800 million kids not learning, whether they're at school or outside of school. So if you could create a sufficient number, $80 billion outcomes funds across the world, you'd have a shot at solving the problem. The money would come from the local government, which typically pays 15%, from philanthropists, from aid organizations, and the investment, UBS has launched a $100 million education, I think they call it social impact fund, but it's basically social impact bond or development impact bond fund, launched with Bridges Ventures opposite this outcomes fund. I say this because you're right. We have to worry about those whom our economic system leaves behind. And we can't always do that through the economic system. Refugees are another excellent example of it. So you find a social impact bond in Massachusetts to $13 million social impact bond. Government of Massachusetts, as I call it, the state, will pay out for every refugee that arrives in the country not speaking the language, that learns the language, has its, often they have qualifications, have their qualification recognized and get into a job. And so you can see how we can give philanthropy a huge boost by shifting to these new approaches that target performance at a certain level, where you don't prescribe to the recipient organization, the NGO, very often, sometimes the business. You will visit the refugees 5 times a day, and you will teach them this and that and this every time you go there. Instead of which you just say, we want to see you deliver so many refugees into jobs. We will pay you so much. You can use technology. You can do this and that. Go do it. So there is actually, and there's a chapter about this in my book, about the revolution in philanthropy, which focuses on outcomes and pay for success. Now, if governments lack budgets, and they don't have money today to pay for an educational improvement, and the investors are prepared to provide that money, and you will see the improvement and pay when the result has been achieved, it's a much better proposition for governments than not dealing with the issue or cutting back on health or whatever else in order to improve education. So we have to change the mindset of governments to take advantage of it. So I think, we were talking about it over dinner again, take the G7 $8.5 billion commitment to South Africa for a green and just transition. What does that mean? Well, it means you're going to have 150,000 miners out of a job. What are they going to do? So you have to start finding a solution. Say, well, they could go into infrastructure. They can go into building the telecoms network, putting up pylons or electricity or other forms of infrastructure, sewage, water, this and that. To do that, you need a government budget. The G7 is saying, the 8.5 is again one of these slogans. It turns out it's not grant money, turns out it's debt, and they don't know when it's going to arrive, and so on. But imagine that you went now and you said, we're going to have a reskilling outcomes fund. We're going to put $2 billion in it, and it's going to aim at reskilling 150,000 coal miners, or part of 150,000. I don't think 2 billion would be enough for 150,000, but I haven't done the numbers. And investors, the G7, put the money up, and they would get, because it's debt, a 2.5% return if the numbers were hit in the contracts. It's a much more effective way to go about it. And so we at the GSG are now addressing this 8.5 billion challenge and saying, how can we improve the lives of people using that 8.5 billion? Well, South Africa has this reskilling issue. It has huge problems in slums. There's increase in migration from rural to cities. They end up in slums. So we're addressing the issue of rehabilitating slums. And there too, there is expertise around the world. The government of Argentina has tried to address systematically now the issue of slums, giving property rights to the slum dwellers. You could then fund infrastructure spent through sustainability-linked bonds. You could fund education or reskilling through social impact bonds. You could create outcomes funds for the homeless, to take them, for NGOs, to take them off the streets and enable them to become employable. So there's a whole world now of new tools to help those whom the economic system leaves behind. I've gone on at length about it because I realized I really didn't touch on it in the speech. So thank you very much for raising it.
We had two more questions, and I think these will have to be the last two because of timing. And they're we start with the right side. Yeah, here, Javiera in the front, middle.
Thank you for a very insightful talk. I feel like I have a lot of questions, but I think my question will touch on a couple of things that have come up already. And you've mentioned the Tesla company a couple of times as a successful disruptive company. I wanted to ask if you could elaborate a little bit more on the kinds of disruptions that you think we need to see to solve some of the issues that we face. And Tesla, I think, is a good example of a company that was very disruptive to the car industry, but that in a way has entrenched the same ways of moving around, of transportation. It's sort of, it's not disrupting the private car. And it is also very indebted, not to fossil fuels, but to the mining industry. And so in a way, if I can tack on a second question, a lot of the mining today happens on indigenous lands. What is your opinion about increasing in a way the voice or the weight of certain places or certain ESG categories like indigenous territories or autonomous indigenous territories in these kinds of indicators? Thank you.
So dealing with the second question first, in the G7 report, we talk about the voice of populations, whether they are targeted beneficiaries or whether they are the victims of some of these changes. And you can measure the social impact. You can value it in similar ways. You just have to go about doing it. On the issue of Tesla, of course, if you had total impact transparency, the cobalt mining would show up as a potentially negative impact. And the pollution that comes from the manufacture of the batteries might also be a negative, and you would know where you stand. But Tesla is going to be reproduced in the financial industry. I'm sure our banker colleagues in the audience would agree. We see fintech platforms coming out now that are seeking to compete with the model of the traditional bank. For example, banks have tended to overcharge poor populations because they consider them to be high risk if they go on overdraft. So an overdraft can cost between 10 and 15% across Europe, in the United States, and so on. You're getting models now that actually address these populations on the basis that the risk is misperceived, and that you can create institutions that provide credit to these populations and have very acceptable loss rates based on whether they've paid their rent in the past, how even the use of their mobile phone. There's a company in Impact, in my book Impact, called Tala, that judges the reliability of a person based on their use of a mobile phone. The fintech industry is going to change the banking model, and the banks, I see my banker friends nodding their head, and the banks are trying to get ahead of that change by incorporating some of these technologies in their own operations and changing their own models accordingly. Education. Traditionally, we've had bricks and mortar and very expensive education. The higher up you go in the educational sphere, the more you pay for it. Because we've shifted now to the ability to do telelearning and teleteaching, we see business models being funded. I've invested in one where the student pays after they have received their education and got into a job, and then they pay a percentage of their income, like a student loan, but capped at an acceptable rate. That is a model that we couldn't, without technology, we couldn't previously expect. Telehealth. We're also seeing huge changes in diagnosis of disease. Of course, it can be done on Zoom, etc., but you're also seeing databases being assembled that enable the doctor to diagnose according to the geographic location and the number of patients in the area that have had similar symptoms and so on and so forth. And there are companies, some of them are quoted on different exchanges, that have been funded to achieve this. I don't think there is a single sector that is not going to be affected now by artificial intelligence and machine learning and the computer genome and all this coming together. I'll give you another example. There is a system in many countries in the United States where if somebody goes into the emergency room and they have insurance, the hospital makes a claim to the insurance company in order to have the treatment repaid. Hordes of people are employed trying to fill in these very complicated forms. They invariably come back from the insurance company saying you didn't complete it with sufficient accuracy. It goes on forever and they don't get the money. Again, I've invested in a company which achieved 98% accuracy. The big health management organizations have had control groups doing it manually and comparing it with what artificial intelligence does in preparing these forms, and they can't match the result. Now, what does that enable you to do? If you have very high accuracy, you can fund the hospital immediately. If you know you're going to get paid and it's going to take a month instead of 11 months, you can organize for a bank to provide the funding immediately on the basis of your application. So I'm trying to give you a sense of why this second tech revolution now, which comes together with this impact thinking, is going to have such far-reaching consequences. I'm taking too long to answer each question, I'm sorry, but they're very good questions. But I'm happy to answer all the remaining questions.
Okay, thank you very much. I like to talk and I hope your vision becomes true in the long run. So my question is about the three dimensions that you were addressing. So we have return, we have risk, and impact. And so far we are teaching just two of these dimensions, and which makes it already quite complicated. We can easily agree quite easily on profit. We cannot easily agree what risk really means. So we have a lot of concepts and how we measure this, and this leads to different results. But I mean, this task is still very easy compared to what you are addressing, because if we have three dimensions, we have three trade-offs, and the third dimension is made of, let's say, if we take ESG, of three dimensions. So every individual can make a decision probably, but if you want to develop markets, and I think that is your vision, we would need standards. And we would need, in effect, a kind of new capital market theory. And could you give us some intuition how this could look like?
You could get a Nobel Prize for finding the solution. And I have said before, there will be a Nobel Prize for showing how we approach the optimization of risk, return, and impact. I think measuring impact is easier than measuring risk, more accurate, and potentially, and easier. I think the relationship between impact, growth, and profitability will emerge over time. So as we begin to measure impact, we will see correlations. The growth rate of a company that was delivering impact performance like that may mirror the impact performance. And the other way, a company that begins to deliver negative impact performance also loses value. So I think as the data begins to flow and we begin to analyze, patterns are going to emerge, and our thinking is going to change. It's a different mindset. But in terms of investment theory, I think optimizing risk, return, and impact gets you to a higher point on the efficient investment frontier than just optimizing risk return. Because in today's world, if you make more money and you pollute more and you create problems for society, your company is going to be worth less. If you grow fast and you have improving impact performance, you will attract talent, you will attract consumers, and you will attract investors. And we already see an expansion in price earnings multiple, the value of the company relative to its earnings. So there's a lot of academic thinking going into this. There are several universities interested in it, and I would encourage the professors in the room to go for the Nobel Prize.
On that note, that's a very good final note. Thank you so much, Ronnie, for a fascinating talk and conversation. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, also on Zoom. Now comes the part that I really dislike. Normally, we would have a reception here and welcome you all to that. We're still in a pandemic, so I would kindly ask you to leave. I also have good news. You are most warmly invited to come back. Already tomorrow, we have our next lecture by our Anna Maria Cowan Fellow Lauren Benton, entitled Endless War, A Global Legal History. And it starts at 7:30. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.